Another article today in the Sydney Morning Herald about Potts Point developments. This one in the Financial Review is titled "YIMBYs and NIMBYs Unite Against a $100 million Packer-backed Potts Point development." And it's basically saying that residents both in the yes in my backyard and not in my backyard are uniting against a $100 million property development here in Potts Point. I want to take you through it, give you a little bit of context about the project and why I think property development now, especially in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, has just gotten so difficult. Everyone being so complacent about change. So the building at the center of the controversy is the Chimes building. It's on Macleay Street and I think McDonald Street. Currently a 12-story building with 80 studios, all studios. Time and Place, the developer, is proposing to knock that down and build a new 13-story building that will be predominantly 3-bedroom units with some 2 and some 1 bedrooms, of which some of those will be affordable housing. So in the article, it's saying that they've had 198 submissions against this development proposal. It was originally as a council DA, but it was later withdrawn and submitted as a state significant development application just because of the planning pathway and the history that City of Sydney has now with taking developers to court and rejecting proposals. We have such high tension around the stock of housing at the moment that a perceived loss of housing will ignite all sorts. What the stage 1 looks to do is to lock in a building envelope. So this will set your height, your bulk and scale and how close you're building to the boundaries, and also your FSR for calculation of your total gross floor area. Now, when you look at the envelope, yes, it looks quite large, especially in the surrounding buildings, which are a few stories below that. Now, the developer here is going for the additional gross floor area and height that's available to them if they provide a certain percentage of that area as affordable housing. So in this case, they get a 30% uplift in the total area and a 30% uplift in height if half of that, so 15% of it, goes towards affordable housing, which in this case, they are providing something around 800 square meters, so quite significant, to affordable housing. That will equate to around 9 apartments, a mix of 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms, which are locked in for 15 years and must be rented out at 20% below market rates for the area. So the developer can sell them, but they have to sell them with that restriction. And typically developers just hold on to them and look to sell them at a later stage. Now they have also submitted a reference scheme. Now the reference scheme is just there to help visually interpret what that envelope looks like in terms of a solid base, what the core of the tower look like, and maybe what the top more articulated top of the tower would also look like. And so here are the numbers. They're building a total of 34 apartments, 4 1-bedders, 3 2-bedders, and 27 3-bedders. The development will have a total of 5,300 square meters of gross floor area, which will equate to about 5,100 square meters of net sellable area. So when you look at most of the complaints of that 198, most of them relate to the loss of, I guess, number of dwellings within that inner Sydney high density housing area. So you had a building that had 80 units and now you have a proposed building that's going to bring it down to 34 units. Now, just remember, it's 34 units, but of predominantly 3 bedrooms and 2 and 1 bedrooms. So when you actually do the calculation in terms of the likely occupation of that building, it will probably be the same, if not more, if you had at least 1 or 2 people living in a 1-bedroom, at least 2 to 3 living in a 2-bedroom, 3, maybe even more in a 3-bedroom. But even if you just went off the number of bedrooms, you're going to end up with something like 108 bedrooms in that development compared to the 80. Everyone is complaining about the loss of density. You have to question it. Now, earlier this year, City of Sydney brought in an amendment to the LEP, which requires redevelopment of an apartment building to retain 85% of the number of units. So in this case, if we had 80 apartments and you needed to retain 85, you have to build 68 again. Now, They've only proposed 34 in this scenario, so I'm not sure how they're getting around that, except for they're going for a state significant application. So I wonder if that planning constraint, which is a City of Sydney only constraint, will apply to this development. For some context, here is what the site looks like, and here's that 60s tower with essentially a wraparound car park, whereas the proposed puts the car parking all below ground and activates the street frontage with retail across both Macleay Street and McDonald Street. Here's what that corner used to look like. So everybody having a whinge now that you're trying to ruin the existing fabric of Sydney. We go through this every 50 years. Buildings don't last forever. Places change. The requirements for places change. This is a double story, or sort of triple story brick colonial style building that was there originally, and it was knocked down in favor of this 60s high density studio apartment living. Here's a few more elevations of what that looks like. One thing to take into consideration is that you're probably wondering, well, it's a 12-story development now, yet they're only proposing a 13-story. Why are they going so much higher? The developments back then, the floor-to-floor space, the floor-to-floor height was only about 2.4 meters, which then equated to an internal space of about 2.3 by the time you took about 100 and 120 off for the slab. So it has really low floor to ceilings, and it's no longer compliant. Like, the apartment design guidelines require that you have a minimum internal clearance of 2.7 within any of the living spaces. So this building, as it stands, would not comply. So even to rebuild this with the compliant heights at 12 stories means that you are going to increase the height regardless. Here's a typical layout of what those studios look like. And here is a floor plan of the existing building with essentially 8 studio apartments per floor. And at the time, this is what Sydney needed. But the Potts Point demographic has changed, much more gentrified. It's a much wealthier neighborhood. You have those fantastic views to the harbour, to the Opera House, to the bridge. And so it's become very desirable, especially for, I guess, your wealthy downsizers who may be selling that house in one of the nice suburbs and downsizing to something that's close to facilities such as your train stations and restaurants and so forth. And as you can tell inside, it looks pretty tired. It's got, old cupboards, old bathrooms, but it does have those fantastic views sitting right on the ridge of Potts Point over towards the harbour. Now, have a guess at how many had the people who have written complaints are probably the people that live in the surrounding apartments. And so what is submitted with this stage 1 DA is essentially a bit of an analysis of what the view corridors look like from the other affected apartments. So what a view was versus what a view would be if this new development envelope is approved. And yes, it has an effect. Every development, if we want to have more housing, we want to build new buildings, we are going to have impacts on the neighbours. It goes kind of without saying. I guess we just have to mitigate what is a reasonable impact to keep development going in Sydney. So here's an image of the existing, and you can see below it in grey what that new envelope would look like. And similarly, standing over in the domain, just above the car park there where the soccer fields are, and looking back towards Potts Point, you can see the original building and in grey what that new building envelope would be. It is significant, but if you look to the right and the neighbouring buildings, it's reasonable. There's much larger buildings on the ridge of Potts Point that currently exist. I don't know the name of it, but the tower above the Woolworths there. And here's a couple of other examples of how the views from the apartments across the road will get somewhat affected. This owner had a view of the whole harbour. Now they're cutting off a couple of the buildings to the right. And similarly with this one, they were able to see the bridge from end to end. And in this new development, from that viewpoint, you would not see the end pylons of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And here is a cost summary that needs to be submitted with every development application, essentially saying that this is a $100 million development. This excludes the land value. This is the development cost to knock down and rebuild this. And so it's not the sale value, it's just the cost of the construction plus all the consultant costs, etc. Now, this might sound a bit controversial, but I am all for this kind of development in our city. It needs it. these are 50-plus-year-old buildings. They take their toll. You know, I own apartments in similarly aged buildings, and there are a lot of strata fees to just keep these things maintained. Some of them will have serious things like concrete cancer. They'll have fire defects that are non-compliances. You have ongoing issues with leaking windows and a bunch of other building issues that owners are really on having to keep to maintain. And at some point, it doesn't become practical. These buildings in the 60s were thrown up pretty quickly, pretty cheaply, and they're not an example of some beautiful Victorian terrace that we should look to try and retain. You might be thinking, well, why don't they just do an adaptive reuse, i.e. essentially look at keeping the existing building and modifying it to make it compliant and to make it, you know, increase that height and increase that density. So the architects have had a go at doing this, but you run into the similar problems of the ceiling heights, and you'd be having to essentially combine 2 floors in certain areas, especially in the living rooms, to make one unit. So it becomes incredibly inefficient. The lifts that are in there are tiny, so you'd be wanting to, you know, knock down the lift shafts and rebuild it. By the time you've done all that, plus all the compliance upgrades to make this you know, fire resistant, it just doesn't make sense. It is so much easier just to knock down and start again. So in addition to those increased area and increased height you can get for the affordable housing uplift, there is another way that developers can get additional height or additional area, and that's going through a design excellence architectural design competition process. So this usually gives them an extra 10% of area or height. I think it's one or the other. In this case, following approval of this design envelope, then the application suggests that they would also look to undertake a design competition to gain that additional area. What I'm going to say next is probably not very popular and will probably divide opinion for those that follow me. And that's that I don't believe council and the government should have so much to say on what a private landowner can or can't develop. The fact that we are having to retain 85% of the number of units is, in my opinion, sounds good on paper, but it's a flawed system, because all you're going to do is have buildings that nobody wants to invest any money on upkeeping because they're not financially viable to do so. It's just funny when you read some of the complaints that have been uploaded onto the portal, essentially stating, you know, that they feel sorry for the 80 people that are going to get kicked out of their studio apartments. Well, let me tell you, if you're an owner of it, you've done really well, because they've been sold at well above market rates. And if you leased it, well, sorry, you leased it and you're going to have to go and find something else to live. Nothing is forever. I just find it hilarious that we live in a capitalist marketplace, but when we all of a sudden come to talk about housing, it is a very socialist left-wing agenda that we have entered. Okay, there's an argument to be made that people that used to be able to live in Potts Point can no longer afford to live in Potts Point, but that's just how the economy works. I personally would love to live on a multi-million-dollar mansion on the waterfront of Double Bay or Vaucluse, but that's not how the economy is built. You either make the money to live there or you don't, and you move to where you can afford. Now, if areas that used to be affordable are no longer, that's just the way that the capitalist marketplace works. And if you're not an owner in that space, then you just have to bear the consequences and find an alternative place to live. People are going to agree with this. They're going to say that's totally cruel and insensitive, but that's just the reality of the world we live in. So unless you want to change the complete economic system, why are we trying to have a separate system for housing? Having said that, I know that there are essential employees that we do need to make cities functional, and that's where I think the 15% of the area being attributed to affordable housing provides that need. So it allows key workers, that may be nurses, doctors, firefighters, police, that do need to be close to the area, a place to live, even though you're in a rather affluent neighborhood. I guess to wrap up, well done, time and place. I know you've battled with a couple of sites in Potts Point, and I just hope that you take this one all the way through to the end. I think it'd be a great development by the time it's done. Reactivate that whole street corner and make a much nicer building for people to live in compared to what's there currently.